Two inseparable 13-year-old girls, bright, spirited, and full of plans for the future, are last seen at their small-town middle school in the fall of 2000. They laugh with friends at lunch, walk down the hall together, and then vanish between the last bell and the parking lot. Backpacks found in their lockers. Shoes left behind in gym class. No trace after that moment. Welcome to Criminal Mind Tales. If you're drawn to stories of mystery, tragedy, and the haunting questions that linger for years, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe and keep watching until the very end, because what begins as a simple school day will unravel into one of the most unsettling cases this town has ever faced, a case with twists that no one saw coming. It started like any other autumn morning in Millbrook, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name. The school buzzed with the usual chatter. Lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, whispers about who liked who, and plans for the weekend. The girls fit perfectly into that rhythm. Ordinary, carefree, bright with the electricity of being 13. That morning, classmates remember them giggling at their lockers. One had a shiny butterfly clip holding her hair back. The other wore sneakers decorated with tiny doodles she'd scribbled in permanent marker. They carried inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else. To their friends, they were inseparable, a match set. In the cafeteria, they sat together near the vending machines, splitting a bag of chips, whispering and laughing until one of them nearly spilled her drink. Later, in math, one girl doodled hearts in the margin of her notebook, while her best friend leaned over to copy homework answers. Everything about the day seemed normal, routine. Nobody watching them suspected that these would be the last carefree hours of their lives. At 2:45 p.m., the dismissal bell rang. Students spilled out in waves, onto buses, into parents' cars, down sidewalks toward home. Teachers locked up their classrooms. The building, so loud just minutes earlier, began to fall silent. But somewhere between that ringing bell and the front curb where parents waited, the girls disappeared. Their belongings were still inside the school. Backpacks and lockers, jackets on hooks, gym shoes left neatly behind. Investigators later said it was as though they had been erased mid-sentence. No chance to gather their things. No sign of preparation. By late afternoon, their absence was undeniable. One girl's mother sat in her car at the pickup line, growing more anxious as the minutes stretched. Across town, the other girl's father glanced at the clock, waiting for the door to burst open like it always did. But the door never moved. Neither girl came home. Phone calls flew between the two families. Friends were asked. Neighbors checked. Still nothing. By dinner time, dread had already settled in. The families knew this wasn't simple delay. Something was terribly wrong. Police arrived that evening. Officers swept through the school, checking classrooms, bathrooms, gym storage rooms. Nothing. They brought in dogs. The animals caught a scent at the back doors, followed it across the playground toward the open field, and then, strangely, lost it right there in the grass. It was as if the trail had been swallowed by the earth itself. That night, the school parking lot glowed with flashing lights as parents, volunteers, and officers scoured the grounds. People called their names into the darkness, voices breaking when no answer came. Helicopters cut through the night sky, searchlights sweeping across the field. But the field gave nothing back, only silence. By the next morning, missing posters appeared on every corner. Two smiling faces side by side, taped to gas station doors, stapled to telephone poles. Beneath them, bold black letters, missing. The entire town recognized those faces. And yet, no one could say where the girls had gone. Theories swirled almost immediately. Some claimed a suspicious van had been seen parked near the athletic fields earlier that week. Others pointed to rumors of a stranger hanging around the school. A few wondered if the girls had simply run away. But investigators dismissed that quickly. Their things were left behind, their routines unfinished, their lives paused mid-step. For the families, the agony was unbearable. One mother refused to touch her daughter's room, keeping the bed made and the light on, convinced she'd walk back through the door any day. The other withdrew into silence, blaming herself for not insisting on picking her child up together. The two families clung to each other at first, but grief has sharp edges, and soon even that bond began to fray under the pressure of blame and suspicion. The town, once tight-knit, now moved under a shadow. Parents held their children closer. Doors were locked earlier. And all the while, the field behind the school sat there, quiet, untouched, unnervingly empty. Investigators combed it repeatedly, certain the answers had to be there. Metal detectors swept it. Dogs sniffed it. Volunteers combed it on foot. But nothing ever turned up. Still, rumors clung to that field. Students whispered that it felt wrong, that sometimes they could see shapes moving in the tall grass at dusk. Others swore they heard voices. Faint laughter carried on the wind. Most dismissed it as imagination, the natural ghost stories that grow in the shadow of tragedy. But the chilling truth is this: the field wasn't empty. It never was. 8 years later, a fire would sweep across it, and when the smoke cleared, the earth would finally give up the secret it had been keeping all along. On that day in 2000, though none of that was known, all anyone understood was that two bright, spirited girls had walked out of their middle school together and vanished. Vanished not into thin air, not into the wilderness, but into the waiting hands of someone they trusted. And though no one could prove it then, the last person to see them alive would later confess he noticed one more detail: a figure standing in that field, beckoning them forward. The girls didn't run away. They didn't wander off. They followed, and they never came back. The first 24 hours after the girls vanished were chaos disguised as order. Police urged calm. Reporters hovered at the edges of the story, and parents clung to the idea that two children couldn't simply vanish in broad daylight. But beneath the reassurances and the carefully chosen words, panic had already taken root. By sunrise the day after, Millbrook no longer felt like the quiet town had been. On Main Street, the bakery that usually smelled of cinnamon rolls now carried the bitter scent of fresh ink from stacks of missing posters. Gas stations and coffee shops were plastered with photocopied sheets showing two bright faces, side by side, under the word missing. School buses drove their morning routes with the posters taped to their windows, silent reminders to every child staring out at the passing fields. Two of their classmates had walked out yesterday and hadn't made it home. The local police department, more accustomed to break-ins and traffic stops than major crimes, scrambled to coordinate the search. They set up a command post at the middle school. The principal opened the gymnasium as a staging area, rows of tables stacked with bottled water, flashlights, and clipboards. Volunteers poured in, parents, teachers, church members, even high school students, forming search parties that fanned across the town. On the first full day, optimism still floated in the air. People said maybe the girls had run off to play in the woods and lost track of time. Maybe they'd taken a dare, sneaking into an abandoned barn or rail car. Everyone wanted to believe the solution was simple, that by nightfall, the girls would come walking back with sheepish grins, ready to be scolded. But optimism has a short half-life. By the second day, as the searches stretched deeper into fields and woodlets, the tone shifted. Police dogs were deployed again, their handlers walking tight patterns across the field behind the school. For the second time, the dogs picked up a faint trail, and for the second time, it ended abruptly, right at the open grass. The ground revealed nothing: no disturbed soil, no clothing, no footprints clear enough to follow. The investigators couldn't explain it, and that uncertainty began to spread like infection. Rumors exploded. Some claimed the girls had been seen at a nearby gas station, climbing into a brown sedan. Others swore a man in a heavy jacket had been lurking by the railroad tracks days before. A few insisted the girls had been planning to run away all along, pointing to scribbled notes and half-formed plans of trips they'd giggled about in class. But the evidence didn't fit. Their backpacks were in their lockers, their jackets untouched, their shoes left behind in the gym. Kids who planned to run don't leave everything they own in plain sight. The weight of the mystery began to crush the town. Millbrook was not a place used to national attention, but television trucks soon lined the curb outside the police station, satellite dishes rising against the skyline. Reporters angled for sound bites, turning neighbors into interview subjects, turning classmates into witnesses. Each word spoken was dissected on the nightly news. Each gesture became fuel for for speculation. At vigils, families lit candles, their faces streaked with tears, their voices cracking on the words of hymns. The mothers held each other first, united by shared grief. But grief is sharp-edged, and by the end of the first week, whispers of blame began to leak. Why hadn't one picked her child up? Why hadn't the other insisted her daughter call home after school? Soon, the two families stood apart at vigils, avoiding each other's eyes. For the children still attending the middle school, life changed overnight. Parents no longer allowed them to walk home. The once bustling playground behind the school grew silent, avoided like it carried some invisible curse. Teachers tried to carry on, but empty desks were daily reminders of what had been lost. Some students claimed they still saw the girls' shadows in the hallway, quick glimpses out of the corner of their eyes. Others whispered that if you stood by the lockers at the right time, you could still hear laughter echoing faintly down the hall. Every community has its breaking point, and Millbrook reached theirs when the first week passed with no leads. The police chief stood before cameras, insisting, "We are pursuing all angles. We will not rest until these girls are found." But behind closed doors, officers admitted they were grasping at air. Every lead fizzled. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. And every hour that passed without discovery sharpened the fear that the worst had already happened. The FBI eventually stepped in, sending agents with experience in abductions. They interviewed everyone, their classmates, their teachers, even their families. They constructed timelines, traced bus schedules, examined attendance sheets. But the clock was against them. The crucial window to recover missing children, the first 48 hours, had already closed. The panic seeped into daily life. Hardware stores reported a rush on locks and deadbolts. Parents escorted their children not just to school, but from classroom to classroom. Churches filled on weeknights with prayers for protection. The sense of safety, once the quiet background hum of small-town life, had been shattered. And yet, beneath all the panic, beneath the fear, one detail continued to gnaw at investigators: the field. Why had both dogs lost the scent there? Why had witnesses last seen the girls facing it, as though something or someone drew them in? The field became a ghost in the case file, always present, always mentioned, but never yielding answers. By the second week, officers dug shallow test pits in the soil, searching for disturbed ground. Nothing. They swept with metal detectors, hoping to find jewelry, zippers, or coins. Nothing. Volunteers scoured it shoulder to shoulder, their boots flattening the grass. But the field remained as blank and silent as the first night. The panic eventually softened into something worse: exhaustion. Search parties dwindled. News crews left for fresher stories. And the posters, once crisp, curled in the rain and peeled from lampposts. The case grew cold, but the fear never left. Parents told their children, "Stay away from the field. Don't walk near it. Don't even look at it." And yet, for years, some swore they still heard faint echoes drifting from the grass at dusk. Two voices laughing, as though the girls had never left. What no one knew then was that the answers had always been there, beneath that very field, waiting. If you're captivated by this story and want to stay with us until the shocking conclusion, make sure you're subscribed to Criminal Mind Tales. Hit that button now, so you don't miss the unraveling of one of the eeriest cases we've ever covered. The disappearance of two bright, inseparable 13-year-old girls wasn't just a crime. It was a fissure that split entire families down the middle. In the days immediately following, the girls' homes were filled with people, casseroles, tears, and prayer circles. Neighbors gathered in living rooms. Volunteers poured in, and hope seemed at first like it might be enough. But as the weeks bled into months with no trace, hope turned sour. The girls' parents, once cordial with each other, began to fracture under the weight of grief and suspicion. The Thompsons accused the Parkers of not watching their daughter closely enough, of letting her walk home alone too often. The Parkers quietly resented the Thompsons' public pleas, accusing them of trying to control the narrative, of painting their daughter as the more innocent of the two. Families who once exchanged Christmas cards now stood on opposite sides of vigils, barely speaking. Behind closed doors, the tension was even worse. One father drowned his pain in bottles of whiskey, growing more volatile with each fruitless police call. A mother sat silently for hours on her daughter's bed, folding and refolding the same sweatshirt. her tears soaking the faded cotton. Siblings who once basked in the shadow of older sisters now lived under the oppressive label of the one who didn't go missing. Every family meal became a hollow ritual, every empty chair a reminder. The public began to speculate, and the whispers weren't kind. Some blamed the parents directly, suggesting strict households had driven the girls to run away. Others whispered about hidden abuse, about secrets too dark for the town to admit. Each theory cracked the families further, their pain now a spectacle for gossip and judgment. What gnawed at both households most was the silence. No phone calls, no letters, no late-night knocks at the door. In an era before smartphones and social media, there was no way to trace a digital footprint, no trail of text messages to follow. The girls had simply vanished into thin air, and the lack of answers was corrosive. As the years dragged on, anniversaries became unbearable rituals. Balloons tied to fences, faded photos taped to missing posters, and candlelit vigils attended by fewer and fewer townspeople. What had begun as a united community effort to bring the girls home had become a quiet, festering reminder of what was lost and what was never found. For both families, the case wasn't just about their missing daughters anymore. It was about survival. Survival through guilt, through suspicion, through the slow erosion of faith in each other, in law enforcement, and even in the possibility of answers. And yet, both families clung to the same haunting question. How could two girls vanish, leaving not a single trace? The answer, buried deep beneath the surface, would remain hidden for nearly a decade. By the summer of 2002, 2 years had passed since the girls walked out of their middle school and vanished. The posters had faded, the nightly news segments dwindled, and the search parties had long since dispersed. What remained was a collection of binders, heavy, gray, and dust-gathering, stacked in the records room of the county sheriff's department. On their spines, in black marker, case hashtag 2000-421, missing juveniles. Inside those binders, officers had tried to capture the impossible. Hundreds of tips, every one logged and indexed. Interviews with teachers who swore they saw the girls after school. Statements from classmates whose memories grew blurrier with time. Reports from psychics who called in visions of barns, rivers, or shadowy men. And then, clipped neatly in the back, a long list of names. People of interest who had been questioned and quietly eliminated. But as years slipped by, the once urgent case became a cold case. Detectives were reassigned. Budgets thinned. Fresh crimes demanded fresh attention. The families still called every month, their voices raw with hope and anger. But the reality was unavoidable. Without new evidence, the case was frozen. Cold cases have a way of swallowing lives whole. And this one was no different. The lead detective, once seen on nightly press conferences, eventually stopped speaking publicly. Behind the scenes, he admitted what no one wanted to hear. There was simply nothing to go on. No fingerprints. No eyewitness accounts that held up. No trace of the girls on security cameras from nearby shops. The trail ended the moment the school bell rang that afternoon. Over the years, whispers kept the case alive. A drifter who passed through town confessed to a crime that turned out to be fabricated. A shallow grave found in the woods led nowhere. It contained only animal bones. A teacher, whose stern reputation made him an easy scapegoat, had his life turned upside down before being cleared. Each lead was a spark, but each spark quickly fizzled, leaving behind only smoke and bitterness. And still, those binders grew. Every odd phone call, every anonymous letter, every theory scrawled on notebook paper by someone who claimed to know the truth. It was all there, tucked into the case files, waiting for a day that might never come. The eerie silence of a cold case is worse than grief. Grief is final. It gives you a place to land. A cold case dangles a cruel possibility. Maybe tomorrow the phone will ring. Maybe tomorrow they'll be found alive. That maybe kept the families awake at night, pacing, praying, screaming into their pillows. By 2006, 6 long years after the girls disappeared, the case was spoken of in the past tense by everyone but those who had loved them. The school had moved on. A new generation of students walked the same halls, unaware that those corridors had once swallowed 2 girls whole. The town had moved on, too. only referencing the case in hushed warnings to young daughters. Don't walk alone. Don't trust strangers. Always come straight home. But the files never moved on. They remained in that back room, gathering dust, waiting, like something alive. And then, in the fall of 2008, fate forced them open again. A field long left overgrowth caught fire, dry grass, wind, and a careless cigarette. When the flames cleared, the earth gave up a secret it had been holding on to for 8 silent years. And with it, the binders were pried back open. The morning of October 14th, 2008, started like any other in the outskirts of town. A farmer woke to the smell of smoke drifting through his open kitchen window. At first, he thought nothing of it. Autumn meant burning leaves, controlled piles, neighbors clearing brush. But when he stepped outside, he saw flames licking across the overgrown field behind his property, orange tongues devouring dry grass faster than he could react. By the time firefighters arrived, the blaze had grown into a low but relentless wall. The wind carried embers into the sky, smoke rolling thick and heavy across the horizon. Neighbors lined the road, watching in anxious silence as hoses hissed and men shouted over the crackle of burning earth. To most, it was just a fire, dangerous but ordinary. To those who had lived in this town long enough, though, the flames seemed to stir something else, an unease, as if the ground itself was remembering. By mid-afternoon, the fire was contained. What it left behind was a field transformed, blackened soil, charred stalks, the faint smell of ash clinging to the air. Firefighters walked the perimeter, checking for hot spots, their boots sinking into the brittle crust of burnt grass. One of them spotted something strange along the edge where the fire had burned hottest, a patch of earth not like the rest, lighter, exposed, disturbed. At first, they thought it was debris, maybe an old fence post, maybe scorched trash. But as one of the men crouched closer, his gloved hand brushed against something smooth, rounded, too smooth to be stone. He leaned in, the air caught in his throat. What he saw, half revealed in the soot, made him stagger backward. It was a skull. The fire, in its hunger, had peeled back the earth's disguise. What had been buried deep enough to stay hidden for years now lay uncovered in grotesque clarity. Within hours, the field was no longer just a fire scene. It was a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the perimeter. Deputies swarmed, radios buzzing, voices clipped with urgency. For the first time in 8 years, the silence surrounding the missing girls was broken. The coroner arrived under the fading sun. Carefully, painstakingly, investigators brushed away ash and dirt, their gloves blackened, their expressions grave. Slowly, the outlines of 2 skeletons came into view, side by side, curled toward each other as though in sleep. The news spread like wildfire. Phones rang, voices cracked. By nightfall, the town was vibrating with the same questions it had carried for nearly a decade. Was it them? Had they finally been found? And if so, what had been done to them? Parents who had begged for closure felt their knees buckle when deputies arrived at their doors. No confirmation yet, they said, not until DNA testing. But the implication hung in the air like smoke. 2 young girls buried together in a shallow grave, less than 10 miles from the school where they were last seen. The discovery reignited everything. Old wounds, old suspicions, old theories long since shelved. For the families, grief came rushing back in waves, harder than ever, because now there was proof. Proof of death, proof of concealment, proof that someone had chosen to silence their daughters and hide them in that field, confident the secret would never be unearthed. But the fire had betrayed that confidence. It had burned away the lies, the silence, and the soil. And now, investigators stood staring at 2 skeletons, knowing they had just opened a door to something far darker than the town had ever imagined. The case was no longer cold. And what came next would shock the community to its core. The fire had cleared the field. The earth had yielded its silence. And now investigators faced the painstaking task of transforming ash and bone into answers. The site was cordoned off for days, floodlights erected to illuminate the charred ground through the night. Every square inch was sifted, every fragment documented. Forensic specialists moved like surgeons, slow and deliberate, aware that the smallest detail could hold the key to unlocking an 8-year-old mystery. The skeletons told their own grim story. Both belonged to adolescent females, consistent with the age of the missing girls. Their growth plates, their jawlines, their bones, science left little doubt. DNA would confirm identities in time. But for those who had lived with this case, the match was already carved into their hearts. What stood out first was their positioning. The two bodies lay close, almost touching, curled inward as though instinctively seeking comfort even in death. But the shallow depth of the grave was telling. It hadn't been dug with care. It was rushed, sloppy, as though the killer had been desperate to conceal them quickly. Then came the details that made even hardened investigators shudder. The bones bore no obvious bullet holes, no clear knife marks. Instead, faint hairline fractures on one of the skulls suggested blunt force trauma. Forensic analysts also noted the unusual positioning of the arms, drawn upward, bent unnaturally, as though bound when the girls were buried. Alongside the remains, bits of cloth had survived the soil. Faded fabric, once bright, still clinging in shreds to the rib cages and pelvises. One piece was unmistakably a school uniform skirt, now tattered and gray with age. Another was a scrap of sneaker canvas, warped by time but haunting in its familiarity. They had left their shoes behind in gym class that afternoon, but someone had given them others. Not theirs, not chosen. The soil itself offered eerie evidence. Forensic tests revealed high traces of lime scattered in patches around the burial site. Whoever had placed the girls there had tried to accelerate decomposition, an act that pointed not to panic, but to calculation. This was someone who had thought about what they were doing, someone who understood the darkness of erasure. The community demanded answers. Press conferences were called. Detectives, standing grimly at microphones, admitted the remains were likely those of the missing girls, though DNA testing was still underway. Reporters shouted questions. Was there a suspect? Was this the work of someone local? How had a grave gone unnoticed for nearly a decade, in plain sight of farms and roads? The families, shattered anew, stood in silence at vigils where candles flickered in the cold night air. They had begged for answers, but answers of this kind were cruel. Confirmation of their worst fears, delivered in bones and ash. Yet closure was not the word anyone dared to use, because closure implied finality, and this discovery was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, detectives reopened those dust-covered binders with a renewed intensity. Every tip, every dismissed suspect, every rumor was reconsidered in the light of the grave. A name crossed out 8 years earlier might now glow with possibility. A half-forgotten interview could suddenly take on sinister meaning. The case files, once symbols of failure, had transformed into a map, one that might finally lead to truth. And buried within that map was something chilling. Early witness statements about a man seen lingering near the school, driving a truck that no one quite recognized. At the time, it had been dismissed, one of dozens of unverified sightings. But now, with the bodies found so close to town, investigators could no longer ignore it. The fire had revealed more than bones. It had reignited suspicion. It had raised ghosts. And it had awakened a hunt that would no longer rest. The question shifted from where the girls had gone to who had put them there. And soon, the focus would turn to a suspect hiding in plain sight. The discovery of the shallow grave didn't just reawaken grief. It reignited suspicion. For detectives who had once walked these very roads in search of 2 missing girls, the past came roaring back like a storm. Files were reopened, names highlighted, and suddenly the investigation focused sharply on one possibility. Had the suspect been in plain sight all along? The field where the bodies were found was less than 10 miles from the school. That detail chilled investigators. Whoever had buried the girls hadn't taken them far. They hadn't spirited them away to some distant state or hidden them in a far-off wilderness. They had stayed close, right under the noses of the very people searching for them. That level of audacity suggested something terrifying. Familiarity. The name that resurfaced first had been scribbled in one of the earliest reports. A man in his late 20s, known around town, but never truly known. He had no children of his own, yet often lingered near the middle school. He volunteered once for a school function, offering to help set up equipment. but had left abruptly when questioned by a teacher. At the time, he was written off as odd but harmless. After all, there had been no evidence. But hindsight sharpened every detail. Witnesses recalled seeing his truck, a faded blue pickup with a rusted bumper, circling near the school on the day the girls vanished. Another remembered him parked near the edge of the lot, watching as students poured out. The sighting was logged, but buried under a mountain of leads. 8 years later, with 2 skeletons unearthed, that memory took on the weight of menace. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered troubling patterns. This man had a string of minor charges: trespassing, loitering, even a complaint from a teenage girl who said he made her uncomfortable at a gas station. None of it had ever escalated into a felony. None of it was enough to hold him. He had slipped through the cracks, dismissed as a drifter, a nobody. But now, those cracks looked like cover. More disturbing still was his proximity to the burial site. Records showed he had worked seasonally for a farm, just half a mile from the field where the grave was found. He knew the terrain. He knew which patches of land were overgrown and overlooked. He knew exactly where to hide something or someone without being noticed. Detectives quietly placed him under surveillance. They watched him from unmarked cars, noted his movements, his routines. He still lived in the area, still drove that same batter truck, its paint now flaking, its windows grimy. Neighbors described him as quiet and strange, the kind of man who never joined town barbecues, who kept his blinds closed, who gave off a chill that people couldn't quite explain. But suspicion was not enough. The case was fragile, built on bones, memories, and the kind of circumstantial threads that could unravel under pressure. Investigators needed something concrete. DNA, fibers, a confession. Something that would tie this man, undeniably, to the 2 girls who never came home. So they went back to the grave. Every scrap of fabric, every trace of soil, every fragment of bone was tested and retested under modern technology that hadn't existed in 2000. And then, quietly, in a lab miles away, a breakthrough emerged. On a strip of fabric buried with the girls, once part of sleeve, analysts found traces of skin cells, minuscule, degraded, but intact enough for modern profiling. The DNA matched, not to a stranger, not to an unknown drifter, but to the man with the rusted blue truck. The suspect who had lingered in the shadows 8 years earlier was no longer just a name in a file. He was a living, breathing man still walking free in the same town where 2 girls had been silenced. And the hunt for him had just begun. Once the DNA results came back, the investigation shifted from speculation to certainty. The man with the rusted blue pickup was no longer just an odd figure on the periphery of town life. He was now the prime suspect in the murder of 2 13-year-old girls who had vanished 8 years earlier. Detectives moved quietly. They knew a case this fragile could collapse if they acted rashly. Circumstantial evidence alone wasn't enough. They needed to build a case brick by brick, each piece of proof locking the suspect into place until escape was impossible. Unmarked cars began appearing at odd hours on his street. Agents followed him to the grocery store, the gas station, the mechanic's lot where he sometimes picked up day work. From a distance, they noted his routines, his preference for cheap beer, his habit of eating alone in his truck, the way he never lingered in town longer than necessary. He was careful, but not careful enough. He didn't seem to notice the eyes on him. Search warrants were prepared but not yet executed. Investigators wanted to catch him unaware, to observe him before he had a chance to cover his tracks. A forensic sweep of his vehicle, however, was already underway thanks to a covert strategy. One evening, while he drank at a rundown bar, deputies photographed a truck from every angle. When he stumbled inside for another round, technicians discreetly collected fibers from the bed liner, dusted the interior for hair and skin cells. The results came back chilling. One of the fibers matched the fabric recovered from the burial site. Another trace carried partial DNA consistent with one of the missing girls. The probability of coincidence was microscopic. The evidence was tightening like a noose. Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through the community. Neighbors noticed the unusual activity. Unfamiliar cars parked near his home, strangers taking photographs. Rumors caught like sparks, and soon the town was alight with speculation. Mothers clutched their children closer, recalling how often he had lingered near the schoolyard. Fathers spoke with grim fury, realizing how close their daughters had been to danger. The fear that haunted the town in 2000 had returned, but this time it was sharper, angrier. Detectives worked fast, fearing the suspect might sense the walls closing in. They built timelines, traced his movements in 2000, interviewed anyone who had crossed paths with him in those critical days. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable. One day helpful, the next simmering with quiet rage. A woman who had once lived next door remembered him digging late at night, the sound of his shovel striking earth long after everyone else was asleep. Piece by piece, the picture grew darker. He wasn't just a drifter. He was a predator. Finally, with evidence mounting and fear of flight growing, the order came down. It was time to bring him in. The arrest would be risky. He was known to keep weapons in his home, and his erratic behavior made him unpredictable. Officers planned carefully, mapping his routines, timing his habits, rehearsing the moment they would move. On the evening of November 2nd, 2008, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled into position outside his weathered rental house. Deputies tightened their vests, radios crackling softly in the dark. The suspect had been seen entering his home hours earlier. Lights glowed dimly through curtains. The street was silent, every neighbor keeping to themselves, aware something was about to happen. The order came over the radio. Go. Officers advanced, weapons drawn, voices booming commands into the night. A battering ram struck the door. Shouts echoed. For a breathless second, there was silence, and then movement. The suspect did not come quietly. What unfolded inside that small, cluttered house would become one of the most chaotic and haunting confrontations the town had ever witnessed. The night of November 2nd, 2008, would be remembered not just as a culmination of an 8-year investigation, but as a moment the entire town realized a monster they had been searching for had been living among them the whole time. Deputies surrounded the suspect's small, decaying house on the edge of town. Paint peeled from the siding. Windows were boarded in places, and the yard was cluttered with rusted tools and scraps of machinery. From the outside, it looked abandoned, lifeless. But inside, the faint glow of a lamp told them he was home. The entry team moved in with precision. The battering ram struck the front door, splintering the frame. Officers stormed in, voices booming commands. Sheriff's Department. Hand where we can see them. For a few seconds, silence. Then movement. From the back of the house, the suspect appeared, disheveled, eyes wide, face pale. In his hand, clutched tight, was a hunting knife. He didn't lunge, but he didn't drop it either. He stood frozen, chest heaving, as if deciding whether to fight or surrender. Tasers were raised, red dots dancing on his chest. "Drop the weapon," deputies barked. For a long, unbearable moment, the air hung heavy, every officer bracing for a deadly charge. Finally, the suspect's arm twitched, the knife clattered to the floor, and he raised his hand slowly into the air. He was tackled in seconds. His face pressed against the filthy floorboards, wrists twisted into cuffs. The suspect let out a guttural growl. Not words, just an animal sound. As officers pulled him up, he locked eyes with one of them and hissed, "You'll never prove it." The words chilled the room. Outside, neighbors had gathered on the street, watching the flashing lights. Mothers whispered to their children to stay back. Fathers clenched their jaws. Some recognized the man as the quiet loner who had waved occasionally but never stopped to talk. Others remembered him as the unsettling figure who always seemed to hover too close to the schoolyard. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This man, this shadow, had likely been responsible all along. The search of his home began immediately. What they found only deepened the horror. In the corner of his bedroom was a locked trunk. Inside were items that seemed ordinary at first. Pieces of clothing, notebooks, photographs. But investigators recognized some of them instantly. A girl's hair clip, a spiral-bound school notebook with a doodle-filled cover, a Polaroid showing a swing set identical to the one behind the middle school. Artifact of childhood, stolen and kept. Worse still, buried beneath junk in his garage, investigators found an old shovel. Its handle was worn smooth, the blade rusted. Soil samples were taken, and though time had passed, the forensic team believed it could still connect back to the burial site. As dawn broke, the suspect sat in the back of a patrol car, head slumped against a window, cuffs biting into his wrists. His face, once hidden in the anonymity of small-town life, was now seared into the community's memory. The man no one had truly noticed was suddenly the most notorious figure the town had ever produced. At the sheriff's office, he was booked, photographed, fingerprinted. The mugshot captured his hollow eyes and twisted smirk, a face that betrayed no remorse. Reporters swarmed outside, cameras flashing as the news spread. After 8 long years, an arrest had been made in the disappearance and murder of the 2 girls. For the families, the phone calls came in the middle of the night. They've caught someone, detectives told them. Relief surged, followed quickly by fresh waves of grief. Justice might finally be within reach, but it wouldn't bring their daughters back. And as the suspect sat in an interrogation room, silent, cold, refusing to answer questions, one thought pulsed through every investigator's mind. If this was the man who had stolen 2 children from their families and buried them in a shallow grave, what else had he done? The truth was about to come out, and it would be darker than anyone had imagined. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, and quiet, save for the soft buzz of the overhead light. Across the table sat the suspect, hands cuffed, back straight, eyes unblinking. He hadn't spoken for hours, ignoring water, food, and every question thrown his way. But detectives knew patience was their strongest weapon. One by one, they laid out the evidence. The girl's belongings found in his trunk, soil traces from the shovel matching the burial site, fibers that linked his home to the shallow grave in the field. With each item, the suspect's composure faltered, just slightly. A twitch of the jaw, a flicker in his eyes. And then came the detail that broke him. Fingerprints lifted from one of the missing girl's notebooks, carefully preserved after all these years. Unmistakably his. The suspect let out a slow, rattling laugh that echoed in the room. 8 years, he whispered, voice raspy. And you finally caught up. From there, the confession came in fragments, chilling in their simplicity. He had watched the girls for weeks, fixated on their closeness, their innocence. On that autumn day in 2000, he followed them after school, lured them with the promise of a shortcut home. In the woods behind the field, far from sight, the nightmare unfolded. He spoke not with remorse, but with a cold detachment, as though describing a hunting trip. The court would later hear every grisly detail. How he overpowered them, how their laughter turned to screams, how he buried them beneath the earth, returning to the spot over the years to ensure the ground stayed undisturbed. The fire in 2008 had destroyed the undergrowth, exposing what he thought would remain hidden forever. The trial was swift but agonizing for the families. Each day, mothers and fathers sat in the gallery, clutching photographs of their daughters as prosecutors presented the evidence. The suspect never looked at them, not once. Instead, he stared straight ahead, emotionless, as if the weight of his crimes meant nothing. But the jury saw everything. The pattern, the proof, the cruelty. Within hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, life without parole. The gavel struck, and with it, a measure of justice was finally secured. Yet even in victory, the families felt only a hollow ache. They had answers. Yes, they had a name, a face, a conviction. But no verdict could return 2 teenage girls who should have grown into women, lived their dreams, built their futures. The empty chairs at birthdays, the silence at Christmas, the space at the dinner table. Those wounds would never heal. In the years that followed, the case became legend in the town. The school where the girls once roamed installed a memorial bench in their honor. Candles and flowers were placed each year at the site of the field. Teachers still told their story in hushed tones, a warning of the dangers that can lurk in plain sight. And yet, the shadow lingered. Because even as the community tried to move forward, one question remained unanswered. Why them? Why those 2 best friends, on that day in that place? The suspect never said. He carried that secret with him, locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. The families had their justice. The town had its closure. But the eerie truth remained. Sometimes evil doesn't explain itself. It simply acts, and then it waits to be found.